Imagine being trapped in an ancient, cursed house where the shadows aren't just dark, they're alive, hunting your every thought. What if the voices of lost souls reach out, whispering your name, pulling you deeper into an eternal nightmare? In this chilling true crime story, you'll follow the terrifying fate of 13-year-old Madeline Soto and the dark secrets that linger in the walls of the house. Stay with us until the end, because this story, it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the supernatural. Madeline Soto walked home from school, the heavy weight of her backpack dragging behind her. It was a quiet afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. Her footsteps echoed on the empty sidewalk, the only sound breaking the eerie stillness. The breeze was warm, but there was something off about the air. Something thick. Her senses were heightened, alert. She felt eyes on her. A chill crept up her spine, though the temperature hadn't dropped. The neighborhood was peaceful, or so it seemed. But in that moment, the world felt too quiet. Madeline turned the corner, her heart quickening. Ahead of her, the old house loomed. She had passed it hundreds of times before. But today it felt different. The windows were dark, the doors slightly ajar. A man stood in the yard. He watched her with cold, piercing eyes. She tried to ignore him, picking up her pace. Her breath quickened. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. He stepped forward. Each movement was calculated, predatory. Madeline's pulse raced. Her feet moved faster, but it felt like she was running in slow motion. The man called out her name. She froze. How did he know her name? Her mind raced for an explanation. He was closer now, his presence suffocating. Madeline took a step back. "Please," she whispered under her breath. But it was too late. The man grabbed her arm with a strength that stunned her. The world around her blurred. Madeline struggled, but his grip tightened. She kicked and screamed, but no one heard. Not a single car passed by. Not a single soul walked the street. Only the rustling of the leaves in the trees, which seemed to whisper. It was the sound of something dark and inevitable. Her heart pounded in her chest. Madeline had never felt such fear. In the grip of the predator, time seemed to stop. She was trapped in his shadow. And as she looked into his eyes, she knew there was no escape. No one would come. And that feeling of dread, it was only just beginning. The man yanked her towards the dark house. His breath was hot on her neck. Madeline could smell the staleness of it. She gasped, trying to twist free. But his hand tightened around her wrist, nails digging into her skin. The old wooden door creaked open as he pulled her inside. The air inside the house was damp and cold. It felt wrong, as though the walls themselves were suffocating her. Madeline's eyes adjusted to the darkness. She could barely make out the silhouettes of furniture. But she didn't need to see clearly to know she was in danger. Her chest tightened. The man didn't speak. He didn't need to. His intentions were clear in every movement. Madeline fought harder. She kicked at his legs, her small body trembling with panic. But he was too strong. With one swift motion, he pushed her against the wall. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She felt lightheaded, disoriented. Her vision blurred, and her heart hammered in her chest. She tried to scream, but the sound was trapped in her throat. Her mind raced. She thought of her family, her friends, the safety of the outside world. But none of that mattered now. In the dark, cold silence of the house, she was alone. The man was only inches away, his eyes never leaving hers. A twisted grin crept across his face. Madeline's instincts screamed for her to run, to escape. But there was no way out. She was trapped in this nightmare, in the grip of an evil that she couldn't fight off. Her hands were shaking, and her body screamed for freedom. But the man was relentless. She tried to kick again, to break free. But her strength was fading. Everything felt so heavy, like the air was thickening around her. Her breath was ragged. The house seemed to close in on her. Her vision faded, and darkness took over. The darkness was suffocating, pulling her deeper. Madeline's senses began to dull, as if her body was shutting down to escape the terror. She couldn't hear her own heartbeat anymore. The room spun around her, its shadows crawling like they had a mind of their own. She tried to fight, to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The man's grip on her slackened, but only for a moment. Then, with a cruel laugh, he tightened his hold again. Her body ached, her muscles screaming for release. Madeline's eyes fluttered open. The world around her seemed unreal, distorted. The house was no longer a house, but a cage. The walls seemed to close in, the floor beneath her feet trembling. She thought she saw something, movement in the corner of her eye. But it was too late. The man pushed her harder against the wall, his hand pressing against her throat. Madeline's vision darkened again. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt like it was going to explode. She gasped, desperate for air, but none came. Her limbs grew heavy. Her thoughts were clouded with confusion and fear. The world around her dissolved, and she was slipping away, fading into nothing. Madeline's body went limp in his hands. The predator didn't let go. He smiled, watching her struggle, savoring the final moments. Time seemed to stretch forever in that moment. And then there was nothing. No more gasping, no more fear. Only silence. The man let her fall to the ground, her body crumpling like a discarded doll. He stood over her, his face shadowed in the dim light. A twisted satisfaction lingered in his eyes. But the house didn't seem as empty anymore. There was something about it, something dark and evil, that had been waiting for this moment. For her. And as the last breath of life left Madeline's body, the house seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for far too long. The stillness in the house grew thicker, almost palpable. The silence was deafening now, but something was stirring in the shadows. The man stood motionless, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. He looked down at Madeline's lifeless body, his expression unreadable. But then a flicker of something, maybe satisfaction, glimmered in his eyes. The house seemed to sigh, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, watching, waiting. For a brief moment, the predator looked around, scanning the room with an unsettling calmness. His gaze lingered on the window. Outside, the evening sky had darkened completely. The world beyond the house seemed distant, unreachable. It felt like the house was a world of its own, separate from everything else. Madeline's body lay cold on the floor. Her final breath had vanished into the emptiness. There was no sound, no movement, except for the faint hum of the house's ancient creaks. But something was wrong. The man could feel it now, the tension in the air growing thicker by the second. He turned slowly, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. His breath caught in his throat. The room, it wasn't the same. It had changed. The shadows had deepened, stretching unnaturally across the walls. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, like it had a heartbeat, hidden in its bones. He looked at Madeline's body again. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Was it too late? Had something gone wrong? The air in the room turned cold, sharp against his skin. It was as if the house was responding to her death, her presence now gone, but her spirit lingering. The man took a step back, unease creeping into his mind. The floorboards creaked under his weight, loud in the otherwise quiet room. He couldn't shake the feeling that the house, it didn't want him there anymore. But it was too late to turn back now. The air grew colder still, an oppressive chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. He took another step, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The shadows moved, stretching further, curling like dark tendrils reaching for him. Something was wrong. The house felt alive in a way it never had before. A low, Almost inaudible hum began to reverberate through the walls, a sound that made his skin crawl. His heartbeat quickened, but he couldn't understand why. He had done it. She was gone. Yet the house felt as if it were tightening around him. He reached out to steady himself, his hand brushing against the cold, rough wall. But it didn't feel like a wall anymore. It felt wrong. The vibrations in the air grew stronger, resonating in his chest. And then the house groaned. A deep, guttural sound that came from somewhere within its very foundations. The floor beneath his feet seemed to pulse, as if the house itself were alive, breathing. His throat tightened, fear creeping up from his gut. He turned to look back at Madeline's body, but the moment his eyes met hers, a cold shiver ran down his spine. Her eyes were wide open, staring at him, unblinking. Her lifeless gaze seemed to pierce right through him. The shadows behind her writhed, twisting in unnatural ways. He blinked, and for a fleeting moment, the shadows seemed to take shape, formless, but undeniably there. He froze. Madeline's body, it had changed. Her skin had turned a pale, sickly shade, almost ghostly. Her chest no longer moved with the shallow rise and fall of life. But there was something else. A faint, unsettling glow emanated from her form. And then came the whisper, a soft, breathless voice, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help me." The man's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, distant, but it was unmistakably hers. His heart pounded, panic rising in his chest. No, this couldn't be happening. He stepped back, his eyes never leaving Madeline's body. But the shadows grew darker, more aggressive. They reached out for him. A cold, grasping hand brushed against his leg. He yanked it back, but it was too late. The house, it was no longer just a house. It had become a prison, and he was its prisoner. The temperature dropped even further, biting at his skin, as though the house itself was alive, feeding on his fear. He turned in a panic, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The shadows twisted around him, reaching, curling like fingers. The walls seemed to move, the once familiar room now warped and distorted. A low growl rumbled from the depths of the house, a sound that was neither human nor animal. The man staggered backward, his eyes wild, heart racing. The whisper grew louder. "Help me." It was coming from Madeline's body, but her lips didn't move. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to burn with a fire that wasn't there before. The shadows around her body grew darker, gathering like a storm. And then, without warning, they surged forward. The man tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive force of the darkness. His body was pulled toward the center of the room, as if something invisible was dragging him. His feet left the ground, and for a moment, he was weightless, floating in the cold, suffocating air. The hum in the house grew louder, vibrating through his bones, shaking him to the core. He fought, struggling against the unseen force, but it was too strong. Madeline's eyes never left him, her gaze fixed in a way that sent terror deep into his soul. Suddenly, the floor beneath him cracked open with a deafening sound, splintering into jagged pieces. He was falling into the darkness. The shadows below him seemed to reach out, pulling him down into the abyss. He screamed, his voice barely a whisper in the thick, suffocating air. But no one would hear him. The house, it had claimed him. As he fell further, he could hear the final words in his ear, cold and chilling. "Help me." But it wasn't Madeline's voice anymore. It was something darker, something ancient. The house was alive. And now it had him. The darkness swallowed him whole, dragging him deeper into its void. His body twisted and contorted in ways that defied reality. He could feel the walls pressing in on him from all sides, the weight of the house crushing him. His skin burned with the cold, but his heart raced with a fire that didn't belong. The air tasted metallic, sharp, like the scent of blood and decay. He screamed again, but his voice was nothing more than a whisper, lost in the overwhelming silence. The shadows, once distant, now surrounded him completely. They pulled at his limbs, twisting and tightening, as if they were trying to break him apart. He couldn't see anything but the endless dark. There was no light, no escape. Just the suffocating, relentless pull of the house. And then, from deep within the darkness, he heard it, the whisper again. But this time, it was louder, clearer. And it wasn't just one voice. It was many, countless voices, each one colder than the last. They all whispered the same thing. "Help us." The man's blood ran cold as the voices grew louder, rising in unison. It was no longer just Madeline's voice. It was the voice of everyone who had ever been trapped within the house. He tried to move, to escape, but the shadows held him in place. He couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't think. The whispers surrounded him, their cold touch wrapping around his throat, choking him. The house had consumed him, body and soul. And as the voices grew louder, he finally understood. The house was not just a prison. It was a tomb for those it had taken.
And now he was one of them.
His scream was lost in the eternal darkness. And the house, it was satisfied. The darkness pulsed around him like a living thing, as if the house had drawn its final breath. But the terror wasn't over. It never would be. His body, bound by the cold shadows, felt weightless, floating in a void where time no longer existed. The air was thick, heavy with the suffocating presence of the spirits who had once been alive, but were now part of the house's eternal collection. He heard their whispers, still swirling around him, their voices growing desperate, urgent. "Help us, please." He wanted to scream, to beg for release, but his voice was nothing more than a faint echo in the vast emptiness. He could feel the house tightening its grip on him, suffocating him from the inside out. And then, through the thick, oppressive silence, a shift, subtle at first, but undeniable. The shadows trembled. The air grew even colder. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, squeezing the life out of him. And then, with a violent jolt, he was pulled back toward the ground. His body slammed into the cold, hard floor, his bones aching from the impact. He gasped, his chest rising and falling in frantic desperation, but the air was thin, barely enough to breathe. But he wasn't alone anymore. The room was filled with the restless spirits, their forms flickering in and out of existence. Their eyes, empty, hollow, stared at him, full of an unspoken understanding. They were all trapped in a house, bound by something dark and ancient, something that would never let them go. The man trembled, his breath shallow and quick. He could feel them all around him, their cold presence seeping into his skin. And then, through the silence, the voice came again, louder, clearer. "Help us." It was no longer a whisper. It was a command, a plea, a warning. The house had claimed him, and now he was part of its endless cycle. There would be no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone. The house had claimed them all. The air in the room thickened with a palpable darkness, a force that was almost suffocating in its weight. The whispers swirled around him, frantic, desperate. Each voice seemed to beg for release, for an end to the torment that bound them here. But the man knew, deep down, that there was no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone. The house had grown stronger, feeding on the souls it had trapped, each new addition strengthening its hold. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though the house itself was breathing, alive with a hunger that never ceased. He could feel it now, that unyielding pull, that same sense of helplessness he had felt when he first entered. It was no longer just the shadows closing in around him. It was the very foundation of the house, pressing down from all sides, suffocating him in its grip. He tried to move, to run, but his legs felt heavy, weighted down by an invisible force. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, its surface warping, as though the house itself was alive and watching. The spirits surrounding him seemed to flicker, their faces distorted, frozen in expressions of terror and grief. They reached out, their pale hands grazing his skin, their cold touch sending a jolt of icy fear through his veins. The voices grew louder, each one melding together in a chorus of pain and anguish. "Help us, please." The man's breath became shallow as his chest tightened. He could feel it, the weight of the house's curse pressing down on him, sinking deep into his bones. It wasn't just the house. It was something ancient, something evil, that had always been here, waiting for its next victim. He tried to scream, to fight back, but his throat was constricted, his words trapped inside. The shadows enveloped him, consuming him, until he could no longer tell where the house ended and his own body began.
He was part of it now.
Trapped in the endless darkness, bound by the same force that had claimed all those before him. The cycle would never end. The house would continue to feed, to claim, to consume. And in the silence, the whispers faded. But the house was never truly silent. It was alive. The darkness around him twisted, alive with a hunger that would never be satisfied. The house seemed to hum with a strange energy, as if it were aware of his every breath, every fleeting thought. It had consumed him, body and soul, and yet it wasn't done. It never would be. The spirits trapped within the house continued to drift through the walls, their forms faint and flickering, like fading embers. They hovered just beyond his reach, their faces etched with agony and despair, their eyes forever searching for something they could never find. They whispered, their voices merging into a haunting chorus. "Help us." It was the same plea, over and over, but now, the words held a deeper meaning. It wasn't just a cry for mercy. It was a warning. He understood now. The house didn't just take lives, it kept them. The souls it captured were trapped in a never-ending cycle, bound to the house, their torment lingering long after their bodies had crumbled to dust. And now he was one of them, a part of the house's collection, its never-ending feast. A prisoner of the shadows that stretched infinitely in every direction. He could feel the weight of the curse, wrapping itself around his heart, squeezing the life from him, until he was nothing more than an echo. The house had a rhythm, a pulse, like the beating of a dark heart. It was alive, feeding on fear, on pain, on the souls of the lost. The man's mind, once sharp, now felt clouded, fogged by the overwhelming presence of the house. It was too much, too dark, too consuming. His body felt lighter, as though his very essence was slowly being drained away. The whispers intensified, their voices becoming a constant hum, a maddening presence that drowned out all thought. "Help us." But there was no help. There was no escape. Only the house, endless and eternal. And now his soul was bound to it forever. The cycle would continue, with each new soul joining the chorus of those who had come before. And in the heart of the house, the dark force that controlled it all waited, patient. It was always waiting for its next victim. The pulse of the house grew stronger, the dark energy surrounding him pressing in from all sides, suffocating him with its sheer force. The walls seemed to close in, warping and twisting in ways that defied logic. He couldn't move, couldn't escape. The air was thick with the weight of lost souls, their whispers a constant, nagging presence that gnawed at his sanity. "Help us." The voices were no longer just words. They were a part of him now, a constant ache deep within his chest, a reminder that there was no turning back. The house had claimed him, and now it was devouring him whole. Every breath he took felt heavier, as though the very air was thick with something foul and decaying. The shadows danced around him, reaching out with cold, twisted hands, their fingers grazing his skin, leaving behind a trail of icy terror. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but the darkness was too strong, too all-encompassing. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding on his fear, feeding on the fear of all those it had claimed. And in that moment he understood. The house wasn't just a place. It was a being, ancient and hungry, a creature that thrived on the suffering of those it trapped within its walls. The souls that had been lost here weren't just lost. They were being consumed, ground down into nothingness by the insatiable hunger of the house. And now he was just another piece of the puzzle. Another soul to feed the darkness that lived and breathed within these walls. His body, his mind, everything about him was slipping away, fading into the shadows. And yet, the whispers continued, each one a reminder that he was never truly alone. Help us. They were all trapped here. All of them. And there was no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone. The house had won. And it would never stop. The cycle would continue, feeding off the souls it claimed, until there was nothing left but darkness. Endless, eternal darkness. And now he was part of it. The darkness seemed to stretch infinitely around him, folding in on itself, suffocating him with its emptiness. He could feel his essence slipping further away, like sand through his fingers, as if the house was slowly erasing him from existence. The shadows around him writhed and pulsed, shifting in patterns that made no sense, as though they had a life of their own. It was as though the house could taste his fear, savoring it like a delicacy, each moment drawing him deeper into its grasp. The cold seeped into his bones, numbing him from the inside out, as if the chill of the house was eating away at his very soul. And all the while, the voices continued to whisper, growing louder, more insistent. Help us. Their pleading, their desperation, was no longer a distant echo. It was a part of him now, a constant reminder that he was no different from those who had come before him. The house had no mercy. It never had. It was a living nightmare, feeding off the suffering of the trapped souls, keeping them in a state of torment and hopelessness. And now he understood that he would never be free. His body, his mind, they were no longer his own. They were part of the house. Just another piece in its collection of broken spirits. He tried to move, to scream, but it was as if his very being was being sucked into the walls, his limbs growing heavier, weaker. The shadows wrapped tighter around him, squeezing the last remnants of life from him until he could no longer feel the distinction between himself and the darkness. And as the house continued to feast on his soul, the whispers began to change. They grew more urgent, more pleading. Help us. Help us escape. It was a chorus of voices, not just his own, but of all those who had been consumed before him. They were trapped in the same cycle, the same endless torment. And now he was one of them, forever bound to the house. The darkness around him surged, swallowing him whole, until there was nothing left but the oppressive weight of the house and the endless whispers of the lost souls. The house had won, and it would never stop. The shadows closed in tighter, an unrelenting pressure that squeezed the last breath from his chest. The whispers, once distant and faint, now felt like a scream inside his mind. Each voice, each soul, trapped in the same eternal torment, had become a part of him. They clawed at his consciousness, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He could no longer tell where the house ended and he began. Everything was consumed by the overwhelming presence of the darkness. The cold, suffocating chill spread through every part of his body, as if his very blood was freezing in his veins. The house, the spirits, the shadows, everything had fused into one, an endless entity that fed on fear and despair. He tried to move, but his limbs were like stone, heavy and unmoving. He could feel the walls of the house closing in on him, squeezing him, trapping him in a space too small for his mind to comprehend. The darkness around him churned, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm, alive and hungry. It was as though the house was breathing, slow, deliberate, feeding on his fear. And then the whispers changed again. No longer were they desperate pleas for help. Now, they were filled with an eerie calm, a sense of resignation. "Join us." The voices all spoke in unison, each one a reminder of the fate he had sealed for himself. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed all those before him. And now, he was one with them, the lost souls, forever bound to the house, forever trapped in its grip. His mind began to fragment, slipping away from the person he had once been.
He was no longer a man.
He was nothing more than a whisper, a flicker of a soul, consumed by the darkness of the house. And in the silence that followed, the house settled into its eerie calm. The pulse of the darkness slowed, but it never stopped. It never would, for the house was eternal, and it would continue to feed, to claim, to consume, until there was nothing left but shadows and whispers. Endlessly, time, or what was left of it, seemed to stretch into an eternity. The suffocating darkness that surrounded him had become all-consuming. His mind, once sharp and filled with fleeting thoughts of escape, had dulled into a haze, unable to remember what it felt like to be free. The house had taken everything: his body, his soul, his very identity. Now, he was part of the endless, eternal cycle that had claimed so many before him. The darkness twisted around him, and though he could no longer see, he felt its presence. It was alive, feeding constantly.
Feeding.
He could feel it in the walls, in the floor beneath him, in the very air he breathed. There was no escape. The shadows that had once seemed so distant, so intangible, now seemed to be everywhere. They were inside him, crawling beneath his skin, consuming him from the inside out. And then something strange happened. For the briefest of moments, he remembered. He remembered the warmth of the sun on his skin, the sound of his own voice echoing in the world beyond. He remembered freedom, but it was fleeting. The memory slipped away like sand through his fingers, and he was left with only the endless, oppressive weight of the house. The house, it had always been this way. It had always existed to trap, to feed, to claim. And now it was a part of him. He had become one of the whispers that had haunted him for so long, forever trapped in the darkness. The other souls, those who had been taken before him, were no longer distant, faded voices. They were his companions now, their agony and despair blending with his own. They shared the same fate, locked in the same prison. He could feel their presence around him, their lost souls intertwining with his, forming a chorus of eternal suffering. The house had claimed him. And now, as he became one with the shadows, he understood. There was no end. Only darkness. Only the endless cycle of torment. Forever. The darkness in the house was unyielding, and its eternal void that swallowed everything whole. But in the deepest corners of that void, something shifted. The oppressive weight of the shadows seemed to recede, if only slightly, as if the house itself was taking a breath. For a moment, there was a stillness that felt almost peaceful, almost. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet before the final wave of terror came crashing in. But this time, it was different. This time, the whispers faded. The voices of the lost souls, once desperate and pleading, had quieted. The shadows no longer reached out to pull him further into the abyss. It was as though the house had let go, if only for a fleeting moment. And in that moment he understood. This was not just a house. It was a reflection of everything that had ever been trapped inside it. Every soul, every fear, every regret. The house was alive, yes. But it was also a mirror of the suffering it had caused. A reflection of the endless cycle of torment it had created. The man, now a mere shadow of the person he once was, felt something stir within him.
A spark.
A tiny, fragile flicker of something that had not been extinguished.
Hope.
Hope that even in the most suffocating darkness, even within the depths of the house's eternal hunger, there was the possibility of escape. But escape, he realized, was not for him. It was for the others, those souls trapped alongside him, those who had come before and those who would follow. In the silence, he could feel their presence. They were still there, waiting. And though the house could claim them, feed on their suffering, there was something the house could never take. Their will, their hope. The house might be eternal, but so was the strength of those it had tried to consume. And as the man took one last breath, he let go of the fear that had bound him. In his heart, he held onto the flicker of hope that one day the house would fall, and the souls would be free.
Not today, but one day.